By the year 2000, Final Fantasy had grown from its humble beginnings into one of the most successful franchises in video gaming history. And as the decade progressed, the success of Final Fantasy was used as a basis for growth within the company. From 2006 to 2009, this saw, on average, 9 new Final Fantasy games being released every year in Japan, and it ultimately led to oversaturation, with many sub-franchises being sacrificed because of this greed. Crystal Chronicles, for example, had 6 games released within just 3 years, and the Ivalice universe had 9 games released in just 4 years, one of which was a sequel to a renamed spin-off of a sequel, which was itself a spin-off of another spin-off. Yes, things really did get that ridiculous. But just as the decade was coming to a close, Final Fantasy XIII then launched in Japan as the next big installment. Square Enix were no doubt hoping that despite its long and often fractious development cycle, it would usher in a new wave of positive praise, a platform from which the franchise could again grow and be seen as a powerhouse within the decade to come. And when it launched, that narrative started to play out. Final Fantasy XIII received a near perfect score from Famitsu, exceeded Final Fantasy X and XII's first week sales, and was ranked as the second best game of the year by Dengeki readers. This no doubt created a lot of optimism at Square Enix ahead of the game's launch on foreign soil, and it would have been bolstered further when Game Informer published the first Western review and scored Final Fantasy XIII at 92.5%. But between then and the game's Western launch, another 13 publications had weighed in, and while many praised the graphics, soundtrack and innovative battle system, there was heavy criticism focused towards the underwhelming story. It also became clear that many reviewers did not appreciate the game's inability to mask how linear the experience was. Once the dust then settled, Final Fantasy XIII had gained the unwanted reputation of being the worst reviewed main series Final Fantasy game since records began. Motomo Toriyama, who had stepped up to direct Final Fantasy XIII, felt the criticism was down to Western reviewers not understanding what they were trying to do. But Edge, a publication who were one of the harshest critics, were quick to rebuff that notion, stating that they did understand it, they just felt it was rubbish. The fanbase were also quite divisive about Final Fantasy XIII, much as they had been about Final Fantasy XII, and it highlighted a real problem at Square Enix. Prior to the merger, Square had always given off the perception that there was a clear vision for the franchise. But when speaking to Gamasutra a few months after the Western release of Final Fantasy XIII, Yuichi Wada's comments revealed that they no longer knew what to do with the franchise, and it meant they entered into the next decade attempting to answer the following question: should Final Fantasy become a new type of game, or should Final Fantasy not become a new type of game? When Final Fantasy XIV then launched a few months later in September, it acted as the epitome of this dilemma. Not wanting to alienate their existing player base, the developers worked hard to make sure it was as familiar as possible, while also attempting to make sure it was as different as possible. The result was a game that was confused, and it was panned in a near universal manner upon its launch. In response, Hiromichi Tanaka, who had been a core component of the company's growth, took full responsibility for the game's failure and resigned as the game's producer. WADA also revealed that the free trial would be extended until such a time that they felt justified in charging people. To try and help this colossal failure, Naoki Yoshida was installed in a dual role, acting as the game's new producer and director. Other prominent employees, such as Hiroshi Minagawa and Akihiko Yoshida, were also removed from their projects and brought in, and WADA promised that there would be a frequent stream of updates happening from that point forward so that players could see that progress was being made. It was admirable given the circumstances, but in May 2011, it became clear just how much this move would cost Square Enix as they revised their net income forecast to a predicted loss of around $150 million. Years later, Yoshida revealed that such was the negative response to Final Fantasy XIV that before he was reassigned to the project, the internal feeling was that its failure would signal the end of the Final Fantasy franchise. To help try and right the wrongs, Yoshida opened up new forms of communication. He decided to be upfront and honest with players about the size of the task they were facing, and what they were going to try and do to fix it. And part of this was revealing that Final Fantasy XIV would need to be rebuilt from the ground up and relaunched as a new game. During this time, work was also being done by other teams to try and create positive Final Fantasy experiences, and the next 3 games were encouraging. Dissidia Duodecim improved on the original in almost every way, Final Fantasy Type 0 released to impressive review scores and sales in Japan, and when Final Fantasy XIII-2 launched, Famitsu gave it a perfect score. But the effects of Final Fantasy XIV continued to be felt. Fortress, a Final Fantasy XII spin-off, was cancelled, and Square Enix had to put all their focus on titles being developed by Eidos, as the Japanese developed titles suffered delays due to staff being moved. Despite this, Theatrhythm did launch as a long-awaited music rhythm game, and a couple of Japan-exclusive mobile titles were released. It set the stage for Square Enix to come back with a bang in 2013. But Square Enix received another black mark almost as soon as the year had begun, thanks to 3 words that sends shivers down my spine: all the bravest. Final Fantasy XIV was panned by critics and fans, but it was nothing in comparison to the absolute lambasting Square Enix received following the release of All the Bravest. On Metacritic, it sits as the second worst mobile game ever released, with an average of 25%, and many publications saw it as symptomatic of Square Enix's mishandling of a franchise that just a decade prior had been one of the most beloved in the industry. IGN even went so far as to release a PSA imploring gamers not to buy it due to how insulting it was. It was difficult to imagine how things could get worse after Final Fantasy XIV, but this was a new low, and the future of the franchise didn't look that bright either. Final Fantasy Versus 13 was still AWOL, Final Fantasy XIV was in a state of flux with Yoshida adamant that they would not launch until it was ready, and outside of mobile titles, which had a pretty poor reputation at this point, Lightning Returns was the only other title on the horizon, and that was only appealing to a small subset of the fanbase. The remedy for this was a huge announcement at E3 2013, as Final Fantasy Versus 13 was rebranded to Final Fantasy XV, and Hajime Tabata was announced as the new co-director. Final Fantasy XIV then relaunched as Final Fantasy XIV A Realm Reborn, and with Yoshida having involved the community in the rebuilding process, it was a huge success. Square Enix even had to halt digital sales of the game because demand was so high and they just couldn't cope. Following its launch, it has gone from strength to strength and is seen as a shining light for the franchise, but also MMOs in general. Within this year, the Final Fantasy Committee was also established. It contained Yoshida, Tabata, Toriyama, Nomura, and Kitase, and their job was to ensure that the quality of the franchise was lifted so that they could start to heal the wounds of the past few years. One of the first releases that followed the establishing of the committee was Record Keeper. It was a significant improvement on All the Bravest, and it was followed up by Brave Exvius and Mobius, each of which continued to show that Square Enix were capable of delivering quality experiences if they respected the platform. Brave Exvius has since gone on to become something of a phenomenon with its own fan festivals, tie-ins with famous pop stars, and even a spin-off title called War of the Visions, which released in Japan last month. Around this time, Tetsuya Nomura was also removed as the director of Final Fantasy XV due to a lack of progress, and such was the state of the project, the board believed it would struggle to sell even 5 million copies when it released. To try and turn around the project's fortunes, Tabata was installed by Yuichi Wada as the new director, but instead of starting from scratch, he decided to retain as much of the original project as he could. Having no doubt learnt from Yoshida's own salvage job, Tabata set about attempting to connect with the community, who for large periods of time had felt like Final Fantasy Versus 13 was vaporware. It saw the creation of a regular livestream called the Active Time Report, and official forums were set up where developers could receive direct feedback from fans. Episode Dusksky was also created for this purpose, but more than anything else, it helped to make the game feel real. Despite some bumps along the road due to Tabata being a bit too transparent, after Uncovered wrapped up, the excitement for its impending launch was pretty clear to see. But only a few months later, Final Fantasy XV was postponed due to concerns about quality. This had a significant impact on Square Enix again. Kingsglaive, the promotional movie, ended up airing 5 months before the game's eventual release, and titles like Kingdom Hearts HD 2.8 were delayed to avoid releasing in the same month. World of Final Fantasy, an adorable spin-off title directed by Hiroki Chiba, was also affected, as it ended up launching before 15 as opposed to after. When 15 did launch though, it became the fastest selling game in the history of the franchise. It has since gone on to sell 8.9 million copies as of October 2019, and if we aren't counting re-releases on non-current generation platforms, This puts it only behind Final Fantasy VII in terms of total sales, which is pretty crazy. It wasn't all rosy though, as despite decent review scores, there was plenty of criticism following the game's launch. To try and resolve these issues, Final Fantasy XV was turned into a service-based game. Alongside paid-for downloadable content, free updates arrived every month which added new features, more story content, and fixed persistent issues. We were also exposed to even more of the Final Fantasy XV universe. A New Empire and King's Knight were released as mobile titles, and Monster of the Deep released as a VR experience. None were well received by core fans, but each experience did have a role to play as they engaged unique audiences. A New Empire, for example, generated over $500 million in revenue within 18 months, despite plenty of negative press. Around this time, Final Fantasy XII The Zodiac Age also gave Western audiences a first chance at playing the international Zodiac job system, and along with Final Fantasy XIV, these releases kept fans engaged while they waited for the Final Fantasy VII Remake. Fans had been craving a full-on remake of Final Fantasy VII for some time, but Square Enix had been consistent with their messaging. The time just wasn't right. But when the stars did align, Square Enix announced the Final Fantasy VII Remake at E3 2015, and it was huge, but despite the fanfare, development ended up getting into problems, and by mid-2017 it was decided that Square Enix would take development in-house. While work on that continued behind the scenes, the focus was placed again on Final Fantasy XV. Royal Edition released in conjunction with the Windows Edition, Pocket Edition followed soon after, condensing the experience for mobile phones, and such was the popularity of the game that a second season pass was announced that would focus on Arden, Luna, Aranea, and Noctis. Square Enix also launched another persistent experience, Dissidia NT. This had released as Dissidia Arcade some years prior, but in 2018 it arrived as the home console Dissidia experience that fans had craved for years. The hope was that it would help Square Enix enter into the realm of esports, but it performed well below expectations, and the team were left hoping it could be salvaged through future promotions, a common theme that had been developing throughout the decade. Towards the end of the year, the Final Fantasy brand then received a huge shock. Due to what had happened with Final Fantasy XV, Hajime Tabata was not loved by all. But from the outside, everything seemed to be going well for him. 15 had smashed the 5 million sales target that it was set. Tabata had just launched its own studio, and they were working on a brand new IP. Nobody expected him to all of a sudden resign and leave the company, but that's what happened. In a press release, Square Enix announced that they had decided upon a change in strategy for Luminous. This saw them cancel 3 of the 4 planned DLC episodes for Final Fantasy XV, and because of this, they swallowed losses to the tune of $33 million. Episode Arden did then release towards the start of 2019 without Tabata, and the other 3 episodes were condensed into a book called Dawn of the Future. And it's perhaps because of everything that happened during this time that the final year in this decade has been quite muted, at least when we're talking about the present. Instead, it's been focused on the past and the future. Final Fantasy VII, 8, 9, 10, and 12 were all re-released on every current generation system, and following on from its teaser trailer re-reveal during Sony's State of Play broadcast, Square Enix's focus has been placed firmly on the Final Fantasy VII Remake, gearing people up for its release on the 3rd of March 2020. It means we round out this decade in a very similar position to where it began, just with a different cause. As opposed to oversaturation and diminished quality, it's now more a sense of apathy. Square Enix still are not sure how to handle Final Fantasy as a brand, and much as they did with Final Fantasy XIII, which was scheduled to release on the 9th of March 2010, they are no doubt now looking at the Final Fantasy VII Remake, hoping it will usher in a new wave of positive praise, a platform from which the franchise can again grow and be seen as a powerhouse within the decade to come. Here's hoping that when we reconvene in 10 years' time, the narrative Square Enix so desperately crave has played out. The Final Fantasy VII Remake project has been completed and was received as a masterpiece. Final Fantasy XVI became the game that galvanized the fanbase, and we saw spin-offs like Crystal Chronicles and Tactics revitalized and appreciated for the unique experiences they brought, as opposed to being mishandled and treated like cash cows. In this scenario, everyone wins. But given the highs and lows we tend to experience as a fanbase, there's no way it's going to be that simple, right?
Thank you, Matt. That was great.
As we round out this decade though, I just want to express my heartfelt thanks to Square Enix for all the work they do with Final Fantasy, and for everyone who has supported us since we started this channel at the end of 2016. It's been so unbelievable to see how much everything has grown, and how much you all appreciate the effort that we put into our videos. Here's hoping that we can continue to tell interesting stories about the franchise that we love in the years to come. Alright guys, this is Daryl signing out. I hope you all have a fantastic New Year's celebration, and we'll see you in the new year for more Final Fantasy goodness.